Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Howdy folks, and welcome to the month in review for November. In comparison to September and October, it's been a relatively slow month, but there's still some good stuff to look at, so let's get into it. Starting as always with the honorable mentions from the monthly painting competition. So first up in the solo category, we have David D. and his Shadow Stalkers. I think what he did with the wings, blending from teal to purple, looks really good. And I also like how his work on the base shows how simplicity can be effective. By adding a couple rocks, covering it with a layer of texture paint, and then adding a few flower tufts, he's made the base look good, and I'll bet it didn't take a whole lot of time or material. Bases really complete the model. Always do your bases, and in this case, David D. has done just that. Now, speaking of bases, Eric here did a great job using basing to really sell the model. His urban camo scheme looks really good too, and it blends into the surrounding terrain. I mentioned when I reviewed the STL files for the heavy weapon teams for the HDF that basing would make or break them, and in this case, Eric has definitely made them. The last honorable mention in the solo category goes to Ghislain for a very specific reason. Painting tanks, vehicles, and armor can be tricky when you want to add depth, highlight, and shadow. But Ghislain here shows how you can take a model that's 80% one single color, and most of it is flat, even, bland panel, and yet still add lighter and darker areas to give it depth and to give it contrast. Now moving over to the unit category, we have Lucas Eisenring, who has managed to do several impressive things with his models here. First, he's painting in white, or at least a very light gray, which can be tricky. Second, he has a really minimalist approach with basically just 3 colors. And yet, despite that, all the detail on the models, including the armor plates, the webbing, the weapons, the clothes, you can still see all the details clearly. It doesn't just all blend into one giant gray spectrum. And third, excellent use of red as a nice, bright, catching accent color. First for the officer and his power axe, and then for the equipment on the radio operator, and then the little badges on the shoulders of each of the soldiers. It's used really sparingly, and because of that, it draws your eye right to it. Now next up, we have Pericator, who also decided to tackle a white paint scheme, and they still made it come out crisp and clean. Just look at how the armor plates and the helmet still have clear definition. You can see that it's really nicely done. The red visors are also very striking in contrast, and they go nicely with the lighter blue pants. So this unit could easily double as like snow troopers or winter troopers, in addition to being some basic urban camo. Now, the last honorable mention in the unit category is Jolyon Dodgson. Jolyon has gone with a darker scheme that almost makes these guys look kind of like ninjas. Though not as difficult to paint with as white, black can still be kind of tricky to highlight without turning it gray or lightening it too much. Now, unlike the other 2 mentions, Jolyon avoids the bright accent color and instead opts for a subtle green on the helmet visors, giving these guys, again, more of a stealthy look or a special forces kind of look to them. And again, well done on the bases. Not only does he use stylized basing, but has added plants, and it looks like even some snow to really sell the effect of what these guys are walking around and walking through. Heading on over to the legend category, we finally have enough entries not only to have winners, but honorable mentions as well. So first up is Bruin Thunderstruck, who has done a really nice job with the object source lighting coming from that sensor. The model is painted and shaded and blended really well. I think the only reason it didn't place higher was because the light source and the rest of the color scheme were a bit too similar, so it's difficult to see just how well everything is done on this model, how well the light and the depth and all of that stuff is reflected. Now, I get it. The point here was to show it as one kind of kind of like when you see something in a shadow, it doesn't have a lot of different color and depth to it. It looks very, very similar. But in this case, I think a little bit more color distinction would have helped really make the model stand out. Moving on, we have un autor cualquiera, hopefully I got that right, who has a number of really interesting things going on with their submission. The choice of using several really contrasting colors with the blue skin, the red cloth, the purple tentacles, put this scheme on hard mode just from the get-go. And it may just be the lighting, but the light, shadow, and fading on the tentacles is really, really spot on. If the skin were to have a bit more of that contrast and blending from color to color, I think this model would have definitely placed. Also, the work on the smoke coming out from that sensor is outstanding. The bright green light source swirling away into black smoke is done brilliantly. Finally, there weren't too many submissions for the Army category, but let's take a look at this one honorable mention here. Mr. Ebling has a really nice color scheme with the beige skin, the red cloth, and then the gray accent. The Army pulls together really nicely, and while the pick is at a bit of a distance, the technique, the highlight, and the shadow looks solid. I think if the bases were complete and the picture was zoomed in a bit more, the picture would do the models and the Army in general a heck of a lot more justice. So kudos to everyone as always who takes the time to print and paint for the competition. They're under a bit of a time crunch. They only have 1 month to print stuff out, paint it, and get it done. So nice job to everyone. It's a lot of work. Okay, so on to the news items. First up, the Duchies of Vinci faction book has been announced. Now the campaign officially starts in December, but OPR is teasing some of the content right now to generate interest. I really like the idea of what they're doing with these because these books are not going to be essential purchases. Like the World Book, it's there to enhance story, provide art and lore, and provide Army showcases, color schemes, things like that. But there's not going to be any rules or characters or stats or anything that's in the book that's not going to be made available to everyone else through the Army Forge. I prefer this so much more than the codex creep that Games Workshop uses to milk customers by selling them a new codex every couple years. The lore book will also introduce 4 named characters for the Duchies of Vinci Army, and all of them have a really good look to them. I mean, what better to ride for cavalry than a charging bull? And anything that has a plague doctor in it usually looks pretty good. The guy who's riding the big mech looks like a nice chunky boy that would be fun to paint and field on the table. And the crossbow sniper looks really menacing too, although I can't say I'm a big fan of the whole standing on the severed head of a change demon. As a change demon player, I must protest. Moving on to the next bit of news, the holiday bundles. For Christmas, OnePageRules is selling those starter boxes. You know, the ones that made their debut at the recent Spiel convention? Well, they brought them back. But in addition to selling small starter kits of models, OnePageRules is also going to be selling hard copies of the Grimdark Future World Book, paintbrushes, tokens, and even customized dice. So this is a really great way to bring new people into the hobby. With one purchase, they can get just about everything they're going to need to play other than a tape measure. And as I mentioned in last month's video, it seems that OnePageRules is getting more and more into producing physical prints and physical products for their games and not just be limited to digital STL files. Now, speaking of bundles and starter sets, OnePageRules has again partnered up with Two Thin Coats to create paint sets and tutorials for the Eternal Dynasty and the Alien Hives thanks to the Edge of Radiance campaign. Now I know, me personally, I'm never any good with coming up with my own paint schemes. I can see one that I like and then reproduce it and maybe tweak a thing here or there. So I think this is a fantastic idea. And hopefully we'll see more paint recipes and schemes for the quote-unquote box art of OnePageRules armies. I mean, who knows? Maybe the Army Forge will one day include a painting section for each faction, kind of like how if you go there right now, they include pictures of the STL files for every particular army. Moving on, the next item, is the Heart of the Rot campaign, a second official campaign to go along with the Age of Fantasy quest. This one is going to center on the Wood Elves, and so dovetails very nicely with the current line of STL releases for the Wood Elves coming out as we speak, and we'll get a look at the first installments, shall we say, at the end of the video. And while we're talking about campaigns, OnePageRules has also announced a new campaign for StarQuest. This one's going to center on the Human Defense Force, and it introduces a new character who is a bit of a renegade. So even if you don't play quests, this model would be a great addition to an HDF army as a company commander or some other high-ranking officer in your army. Now moving on, our next item of business is an interesting one. OnePageRules gave a heads up in their recent monthly video chat that next year, in September, there will be a massive overhaul of all of the armies. Now, as explained in the video, some special rules and factions are sharing rules enough that some of the rules no longer seem unique. For example, like Undead and Robot are basically the same thing, and then you bring in the Alien Hives who have no surrender or something like that. It's the same rule with 3 different names, and it kind of takes away from the uniqueness of it. If 3 different armies have the same rule, well, then there's nothing really special about that rule for any of those armies. So the overhaul is meant to make the armies feel more unique, as well as to potentially trim down the special rules for some armies that have lots and lots of special rules just as the default. There are other issues and other reasons, but these are the biggest ones. Now, given that the execution of these changes is 10 months away, but he wanted to mention it now, I think we can assume that these are going to be some very significant changes. And as he pointed out in the video, this may fundamentally change the way some armies are played. So I have a feeling there are going to be a lot of people who are very happy with these changes and a lot of people who are going to be very angry at these changes. We'll have to see what happens. Fortunately, we got almost a year before we have to worry about crossing that particular bridge. Okay, so with the news items more or less out of the way, let's finish off the monthly review with the look at the STL files released in November. First, the terrain release for this month offers an industrial aesthetic that I think will be a great addition to skirmish games, though you'd have to print a lot of these to make really extensive use of them in a full-size game of Grimdark Future. Moving on, the quest model for this month is a human monk, and I must say he has a lot of character. He seems to kind of straddle the fence a bit between being a berserker and being a warrior monk. I took one look at the STL file, and I pictured painting him with red hair and painting those pants blue and white striped, very similar to the berserkers and the slayers that you see over in Warhammer Fantasy. So obviously I'm getting a little bit of influence from there. I get that OnePageRules doesn't want to go with a stereotypical warrior monk and make him look like a Shaolin priest or something like that. But if it weren't for that icon around his neck, I would have pictured this guy more of as a fighter than a monk. I mean, the model by itself is great. It just doesn't scream monk to me. It screams more like pit fighter. So I'm curious to see what the painting competition can do with this, and we'll see what they can come up with. So now let's move on to the Human Defense Force releases. First up, we've got the Drill Sergeant. And while there isn't a whole lot to set the Drill Sergeant model apart from the rank and file in terms of weapon and equipment, I have to say I really dig the hand gesture. That is, as the Fat Electrician called it, a weapon of mass instruction. Moving on to the next hero character, the Psy Hacker here looks suitably techie, and he's got his laptop, though the number of antennae sticking out the back seems a little bit excessive and makes him almost look like a bit of a porcupine. So I get they were trying to go with the fact that he's got tons of equipment and is receiving and sending tons and tons of signals, but maybe 1 or 2 antennae instead of a whole array of them? But that's just me. Now, as for the sappers, I like them. I know some folks don't like the look, especially of the bedrolls. They think they make it look a little too much like the Boy Scouts, and I can appreciate that. But those guns look fantastic. The grenade launchers for sure. Some of the other ones look pretty decent too, but those grenade launchers really sell it for me. And also, The furry companion's pretty neat too. In the past, I've been pretty harsh on the little animal additions to some of these army units, but this one works. Bomb squads use dogs, so having a canine companion to a group of sappers, it's a really nice touch. Now, there was a tank release as well, but I'm going to skip over it because it looks very, very similar to the APC, and I already talked about the APC last month, so there's nothing new to add here. I do, however, want to talk a little bit about these grunts. They're an interesting addition to the HDF army. In terms of looks, the helmet's straight out of Halo, which isn't bad. I like the look of the Spartans in Halo. The dogleg design for the lower half of the models is also a bit of an unexpected development. The HDF is an army of humans, so to make the robots look non-human, well, that's different for sure. What I don't fully understand yet, though, is why they're in the army at all. The HDF is the human defense force. If they can produce robot soldiers, then why bother sending out human troopers? I can see these if they were designed as battle suits piloted by humans, but throwing in fully autonomous robotic soldiers just doesn't fit the vibe of the HDF, at least not to me, especially when they are specifically designed to not look like humans from the waist down. So I'm okay with the models by themselves, I just don't see why they're in the HDF instead of in the Robot Legion, the Machine Cults, the Titan Lords, or some other faction that seems to be more geared towards sentient or autonomous robots rather than humans. All right, moving on to the Wood Elves, we get our first look at them. And starting with these first two hero models and the unit of defenders. Right off the bat, this is not your stereotypical Wood Elf look. Of course, there's going to be a lot of nature and natural influence in the models. But because they're elves, there's usually this expectation that it will be nature tinged with a high degree of refinement. Kind of like the Wood Elves in, say, Warhammer Fantasy or especially in Lord of the Rings. These guys are going in an entirely different direction. Sure, their weapons have curves on the blades instead of being ramrod straight. The bow that he's carrying looks very, very organic as well. But what sticks out to me are other things, like the fact that many of the characters are more or less naked with just basic wraps of cloth, or the fact that within their armor they have teeth tied onto leather thongs, or that they're barefoot with leg wraps. Or you have the Spellweaver that's all decked out in feathers and looks more like an animistic shaman than someone who learned magic from formal schooling. It gives off a very primitive feel to it. Tolkien elves come across as, we are so sophisticated we can live more advanced in the forest than you humans can live in your cities of stone. A very supercilious kind of approach to it. These guys come across as the elves that time forgot. They seem more savage than sophisticated. I can almost see these guys and the High Elves as not liking each other. The High Elves look at these Wood Elves as kind of like their redneck cousins, while the Wood Elves look at the High Elves as fragile little princesses. I also say I really like what they did with the animal companion, at least for the hero. He's bigger, he looks a bit more menacing, he doesn't look like someone who's bringing their Pokemon pet to work with them. Although, when we take a look at the scouts, the cute pet on the shoulder does make a return appearance. The one that's with the hero looks more like the dog in the HDF Sapper unit, while the one on the scout, he's the adorable Disney sidekick. Now, while we're on the subject of animals, I do like that they're breaking away from using eagles or hawks for their flying animal warriors and instead going with owls. Giant owls isn't a creature that, at least not that I've seen a lot in fantasy settings, though I'm by no means an expert on fantasy. So kudos to OPR for finding a way to be different, stay within the faction, and not come across as trying to be different just for the sake of being different. They managed to find something that perfectly fits, that is unusual from the standard. My only complaint, again, who takes their young child to war with them? Moving on. The last model we take a look at here is not part of the Wood Elves, though I think it absolutely could be. It's a giant otter. And this giant otter is the legendary unit for the Ratmen. Now, I had to laugh when I looked at it, and not in a bad way. If humans ride elephants as giant beasts into war, what exactly would a Ratman ride? I certainly wouldn't have thought of a giant otter, but there he is. A giant otter fully decked out in army and war gear, carrying a Ratman wizard on its back. I think it's cool. I am really excited to see who paints this thing up and what they can do for it, because there's a lot of detail there and there's a lot of potential. I do wonder at the same time if there was any discussion about bringing something like this guy into the Wood Elves. He would most definitely fit in that natural aesthetic that the Wood Elves are trying to bring across. All right, folks, so there you have it. Another month down. What upcoming things are you excited for? What do you think about the new designs for the Wood Elves in the HDF? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, keep your dice on the table.